I'll often be asked about the learning route I've taken to get my game development skills to the point where they are today. In celebration of my 10 years of game development experience, I'll take you on the journey from my very first steps with Python, about a decade ago, to beating thousands of other entries and winning medals in the Ludum Dare with Pygame this year. I may not have learned in the most efficient manner, but I'm happy with where I am today, so I'll share what I was learning with each project and the mistakes I've made. Hopefully this should provide some valuable insight into how you could approach improving your own game development skills. While most of my projects are with Python and Pygame, there may be a couple Godot projects mixed in as well. Let's rewind the clock all the way back to 2013. I was 12 years old and starting to get tired of Legos. I was super into Minecraft, but I was only allowed to play 30 minutes of video games per day. Out of boredom, I decided to learn to code and maybe make my own game so I could play more than 30 minutes. On one September evening, I downloaded the Python interpreter and found a tutorial to start learning. I didn't think I was smart enough to make games with graphics at that point, but in October, I decided to give Pygame a try. I quickly got attached to it after finding a few example scripts, and I've been using it ever since. I hadn't figured out what lists were yet. All of my code was in one file. There wasn't a shred of object-oriented programming, and I didn't follow any tutorials, which was a mistake, but by December, I had my first proper game, Super Launchers. It's like Super Smash Bros., but bad. In 2014, I made significant updates to Super Launchers. It still wasn't great, but it at least looked better. I followed it up with a graphical version of a text-based roguelike I was making before learning Pygame called Gladiator Arena. I was just using the basic put an image on the screen and move it tricks, but I did have a knack for modeling the logic behind relatively complex mechanics. Then I stumbled upon the Vampire Survivors gameplay when I made Battlegrounds. Yes, this was before PUBG was a thing. The mechanics are probably self-explanatory. I followed it up by making Cookie Clicker and Flappy Bird clones to test my skills. I still didn't know what lists were for, so I had several separate pipes that I accessed by name and teleported instead of using a list. Shortly after Flappy Bird, I finally figured out what lists were for and I made Freefall, a meteor dodging game. With that, my first full year of game development was complete without ever touching object-oriented programming. 2015 was the year where I really started to make unique games. Unfortunately, I only have the games that I actually released from this year because I switched to a new computer that I accidentally wiped when I was installing 10 different Linux distros to support the Steam machine when I was releasing Drawn Down Abyss in 2019. I started with the creatively named Sandbox RPG. It was top-down Minecraft with more RPG mechanics. This is when I learned to break my games down into tiles and took a crack at writing a physics system. Much like Super Launchers, it was still a bit scuffed and occasionally involved teleporting unexpectedly. I followed it up with Force, a physics game about pushing things around with force fields that had some really broken physics. Some of the artwork was starting to look nice though. The final notable project from 2015 was an underground game that I forgot the name of. There was a small underground town that you collected resources for, but I've lost almost everything from that project. It was my first proper step into pixel art. Overall, my motivation was pretty low that year. I took several breaks without making anything for long periods of time. I had passed the initial rapid rate of improvement and was slowing down, but my games still looked like beginner projects. In 2016, I started going by the name DaFluffyPotato, and I made an Infinite Runner game with references to some Warriors fanfiction I wrote on Wattpad around the time that was actually somewhat popular. Oof. Derpathon's gameplay actually holds up pretty decently nowadays, surprisingly. After Derpathon, I learned about the Ludum Dare and decided to try and compete in my very first game jam, Ludum Dare 35. I had to make a game from scratch in 48 hours. Unfortunately, I ended up sick, but I decided to push through and participate anyways. I made Rocky, a strange tower defense survival thing involving transformation that's just an overall mess of mechanics. As the rankings at the end of the jam indicated, it wasn't a very good game. Even though it didn't do very well, this was a massive turning point in game development for me because I discovered I could get good feedback on my games and really put my skills to the test. It's really hard to be motivated to make games when nobody wants to play them and you rarely get any feedback, but game jams let you exchange feedback with other developers. Whether you're new to game development or you've been making games for years, I think game jams are one of the best ways to improve as a game developer. I also discovered Daniel Linson and RXI from that first game jam, who ended up being huge inspirations for my art style down the road. After Rocky, I reiterated on the ideas from Sandbox RPG and made its open world counterpart, Zicania. This was my biggest project from the time, and would be my biggest project until Super Potato Bra in 2018. I still wasn't using object-oriented programming, but I had figured out how to use dictionaries, hash maps for you non-Python people. I didn't understand why lookups were so fast. They seemed like magic, but I didn't look into it and quickly put them to work to create the infinite worlds of Zicania. For those who don't know, dictionaries are the solution to 90% of performance issues in game development. From this point, I had figured out how to make much more technically impressive games with Pygame and the restrictions of Python. Before I knew it, it was time for Ludum Dare 36. There were no ratings this time due to the beginning of the transfer to the new Ludum Dare website, but I participated anyways and made Artifact Hunter. This time I actually got some pretty positive reactions. While unrelated to the reactions, it was the first time I put music into one of my games. I had just learned about beatbox.co and made the game's music with it. When October rolled around, the Ludum Dare had a special event that they don't do anymore. The goal was to take any game dev project and make money off of it somehow. I polished Artifact Hunter, added more content, and even took my first crack at multiplayer, although it only worked with extremely low latency because the connection was synchronous and blocking. I released it and got an astounding 2 sales. I still have the records of that first payout from itch.io, and the payout ID indicates that it was one of the first 3,000 payouts ever done by itch.io. While most people would consider 2 sales a failure, I was 15 and just trying to win the Ludum Dare October Challenge, which I did, and I was very happy with. After Artifact Hunter, I made Raise the Roof for Ludum Dare 37. It was a weird game where you had to keep the roof from collapsing by shooting at it and farming stuff. It was a strange game and didn't do too well because the mechanics weren't well explained. My final project from 2016 was Pokemon Violet. Yes, this is something like the 3rd time doing something suspiciously indicative of the future. I just wanted to make a Pokemon knockoff. I got as far as the world, walking around, menus, and semi-functional battles. Overall, 2016 was the year I finally settled into pixel art and got into the groove of game jams to keep me improving. It's the year that set me on the track to get where I am now. In 2017, similar to how I learned most of Pygame, and I don't recommend learning this way, I stumbled upon an example script for a platformer with simple, reliable tile physics. That one script had the algorithm that I still use and teach for tile physics to this day. I unfortunately have no idea where I found it or who made it, and I don't have a copy. I use this physics knowledge in my Ludum Dare 38 game Solitary Freedom. It's a simple sliding puzzle game that, surprise surprise, didn't do too well when I got my rankings for that gem. For Ludum Dare 39, I made Precious Cargo, a game where you must protect a crystal from pirates on a flying ship. This is probably the first game where you can look at it and say, that's a DaFluffyPotato game. Around that time, some developers were unhappy with the Ludum Dare's buggy website and management, so possibly for this reason, the Alka Jam was made and popularized. It was another 48-hour game jam with nearly identical rules and a better website that I decided to join. I made Alchemic Archer, a game where you fight slimes with potion-tipped arrows that you make from items in the environment. Surprisingly, I ended up winning 3rd place in graphics. There were only 58 games, but winning my first medal was an amazing step up from my previous projects. Afterwards, I tried to participate in a mini event that the Alka Jam was hosting and started creating what would later turn into Gleamstream 5 years down the road, but I dropped out because I was too busy with stuff in real life. Around that time, I also took another try at multiplayer game dev, this time with threading so that it would, actually work. It did work, which I was very happy with, but I got bored of it fast. Eventually, December rolled around and it was time for another Ludum Dare. After coming off of a graphics medal in the Alka Jam, I decided to try and aim for a high graphics score in the Ludum Dare with The Crushed Sky. It was a weird floaty precision platformer, but it had a boss and it looked pretty good. I also learned about recursion to create box pushing physics, and finally, after 4 years, started splitting up my code so it wasn't all in just one file. I ended up placing 28th out of over 1,000 in graphics, which I thought was awesome. 2017 was also the year I touched OpenGL for the first time experimentally and started learning about object-oriented programming. Not that I would really use it. Alright, it's time for 2018. This was the year that I became that Pygame guy for multiple reasons. I kicked off the year with a non-game jam project Hungry, where I learned about Perlin noise and world generation. I followed it up with Lollipop Ninja for the second Alka Jam, a game about a ninja with a sweet tooth and social anxiety. I won first place in graphics, and the game actually got traction on itch.io outside of people from the game jam playing it. Some people even speedran it. I also made PX Editor, my pixel art software that I used for my animations until I bought Sprite. I was animating in MS Paint before that. That year I decided to participate in the Python specific game jam called PyWeek. I had a bad experience with people gaming the anonymous voting system and leaving mean comments and bad ratings across the board, but I used Buska Kyol for the first time and made Guardian of the Tree, a game with an atmosphere I was very happy with and still am to this day. PyWeek has supposedly addressed the issues from that event, so I may participate again someday, but that's the only one I've done so far. Another Ludum Dare was up next, where I made Quick Draw TCG, a card game bullet hell platformer roguelite. This would turn into Drawn Down Abyss later, but I still like the music. Up to this point, I was mostly just doing basic things that you could say Pygame was meant to do. However, I took my first step towards pushing Pygame to unusual areas by writing my own real-time raycaster. I considered making a game with raycasting, but it took another 5 years for that to become a reality. I experimented in other areas as well that year by working on an MMO type game. I got much further than I did with my prior multiplayer projects and quit when I got to the I have to make content part. After all that experimentation, it was time for the third Alka Jam. I made Whirling Blades, an isometric fighting roguelite with a growing arena. The questionable mouse controls and a couple other factors really held the game back. It won the bronze medal for gameplay, and I came closer than I've ever been to not winning a medal in the Alka Jam. Even though the game had issues, it looked like a lot of fun in the GIFs, so it was featured on PC Gamer, Rock Paper Shotgun, and the front page of itch.io for some reason. Just for reference, I only had 5,000 downloads between all of my games on itch.io at this point. With what seemed like newfound success, I decided it was time to build a proper PC and stop using the laptop I had been using for the last few years. Since I could actually run OBS with the new PC, I decided to start the Pygame platformer tutorial series that got my YouTube channel off the ground, although it took a while to get proper traction. In this context, you can clearly see how I made those tutorials just as I finally had a decent grasp of Python and Pygame. Next up was the 40-second Ludum Dare, where I made Bullet Farmer, a game where you farm bullet plants to shoot invasive slimes with a machine gun in true Floridian style. While there weren't any major improvements here, I had a discussion in the community for that jam that directly led to my next project. See my VR video for more details on that discussion. My next project was going to be my first proper paid game, not like that October challenge thing in the past. Super Potato Bruh. I put 100 hours into it in a couple months and released it hoping to make $100, but to my surprise, I ended up making almost $4,000. I still wasn't really using object-oriented programming. It's funny how I suddenly had a much harder time finishing projects once I got into object-oriented programming later. There's a saying that there are two types of game developers. There are those that make games, and there are those that write good code. When you're doing what I was doing and bouncing between two game jams that run 2 to 3 times a year, there's always something going on. It was time for the fourth Alka Jam. This time I made Spike Dungeon. It's a game where you travel downward through a procedurally generated map, avoid hazards, eat, and collect power-ups as you go. This is a game with a design that I'm still happy with even 5 years later. It ended up being the game that won me my very first game jam. As the final project of 2018, I made a weird procedurally generated roguelite. While not innovative, the aesthetic led to my next paid game, Drawn Down Abyss. 2018 was probably my most productive year in game development by a long shot. In 2019, I slowed down a bit. I got into VR at the end of 2018 and I was busy getting to the top 100 in Beat Saber, competing in tournaments, and creating Hitblock. My first game jam entry of the year was Spellcaster's Forest, a game made for the 5th Alka Jam where the core mechanic was based on the Android pattern lock. The player could cast abilities to fight monsters in the arena and fight bosses. It was somewhat of an average game jam entry for me. My next game was for the 6th Alka Jam. Bouncy Shots is air hockey, except you have to shoot the puck instead of hitting it directly because I'm American, not Canadian. As you can see, I decided to throw artwork out the window for this one and depend fully on visual effects. This is when I developed my sparks and circles system that visually differentiates my games from most others. Much like low-resolution pixel art, sometimes adding restrictions and getting back to the basics breeds creativity. Even without drawing anything, I still managed to get second in graphics. I didn't do any Ludum Dares in 2019, so the next game was for yet another Alka Jam. I made Shadow Tower a super low-effort game because I had a lot of other stuff going on that weekend. However, I finally switched from Buskakill to LMMS, and I learned a very valuable lesson. People's impressions of one aspect of a game, such as graphics, are heavily influenced by other aspects, such as music in this case. I won that event and still somehow got second in graphics. I have to imagine I got lucky with the people who happened to rate the game because there's no way I should have won. Regardless, the interplay between game aspects is an idea that has a huge impact on how I make games today and led to something special later on. After Shadow Tower, I finished up development for my second Steam game, Drawn Down Abyss. As I mentioned, it's based off of 2 of my earlier games. You descend down a cave system while trying to survive by using cards that give you special abilities. It's a deck builder, roguelite, bullet hell platformer based on the original Risk of Rain. The feedback was pretty much, wait, this genre soup somehow works? It had a similar amount of time spent and profits as Super Potato Bro. I think the idea definitely has potential, but I really needed to execute on it with more content and polish. To wrap up the year, I finally tried out Godot VR for the first time, finally bought Sprite to replace the PixArt software I wrote, and graduated high school with a 2-year college degree. 2020 was an eventful year in a completely different way than the previous ones. In February 2020, I made Aeroblaster for the 8th Alka Jam. You jump around through a vertically looping map and shoot turrets. It's not a complicated idea, but I feel I executed well on the idea. Oddly enough, when beginners take inspiration from my games, more often than not, it's Aeroblaster. I've seen people imitate the art style, the mechanics, and sometimes both. This was also when I finally hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube. All of my previous success with Super Potato Bra and Drawn Down Abyss was done without a serious social media presence, and to this day I still haven't released a Steam game with the marketing power of a YouTube channel, so I have no idea what would happen. In the beginning of March, I got my first software development job working on rockets, the kind used to get people to the ISS and put satellites in space, not the blow stuff up kind. As we all know, the same month, just 1 week later, COVID hit. I started working remote, but aside from that, it didn't affect my lifestyle much. However, there was a big boom in the devlog YouTube genre during COVID with Danny and the others that I got on early with my unnamed devlog project where I pushed Pygame's limits with grass, water, foliage, and cloth simulations in a real-time game. While that project was put indefinitely on hold, its spirit lives on both in the reuse of its codebase and the ideas for current projects. Now it's time to get back to the regular game jam cycle and take a look at my 9th Alka Jam entry, Linus. This is a game idea that honestly should have been a mobile game. You bounce a ball upwards by drawing platforms that bounce it with physics. The success of Bouncy Shots made me want to try the whole no drawing thing again, and I got quite a good result. I think a few people did actually port the game to mobile, some directly and some just copying the idea, but I don't know where those went. For the 10th Alka Jam, I decided to step outside my comfort zone and learn Godot during the jam. There's a time lapse if you want to see me reading through documentation while making a game, which I think is quite interesting. It didn't do nearly as well as my Pygame entries, but it was my first serious step outside of Pygame, which is important. It taught me that I don't really have an interest in making 2D games with anything other than Pygame, but I also saw Godot as a serious option for any 3D or VR projects I wanted to work on. To finish off the year, I headed back to the Ludum Dare, which I hadn't done in ages. I developed Shifting Edge for the 47th Ludum Dare, which is just rolling blades, but with angry bushes, the world's most violent gardener, and the bad parts of the controls made worse. As you could guess, it didn't do too well even though it looked nice. Just before the end of the year, I also hit 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. That's 1,000 to 10,000 in a year. The power of BOVID. 2020 was the year I started my computer science degree and gained the shackles of college. You can really tell from the amount of games I've put out recently. I'm recording this video just shortly after finishing my degree though, which I'll make a video about soon. Moving on to 2021, aside from making that one video that made a bunch of people angry, it was probably the most uneventful year for me. I made this weird archery game with a restricted color palette that I never finished, but was revived in a collaboration you'll be seeing very soon. For the 11th Alka-Jam, I made Wandering Soul, a weird platformer that mixes in more traditional bullet hell mechanics. This is actually my most downloaded game at the moment, but the innovative thing here was that I made Wandering Soul while live streaming the whole thing. I ended up hitting almost 200 concurrent viewers, which was awesome. Jumping to the next Alka-Jam, I made Cave-In for the 12th Alka-Jam. If you've been counting, I participated in every Alka-Jam up to this point, but sadly this streak would be broken very soon. Cave-In is a simple arcade game based on a Minecraft minigame when I was,
on duty.
Yeah. It's definitely the runt of my game jam entries in the last 5 years. No worries though, this was the first year I was working on that one game that people keep asking me about, Vagrant. It's Aero Blaster, except it's an RPG, and it ended up looking quite good in my opinion. I finally fully stepped into an object-oriented approach for the game's codebase after 8 years of experience. This is also the first project where I have truly split up my code into more than just a couple files. As one more fun fact, it's on the banner of r/Pygame. To top off the year, I created my grass framework that gives me the graphical edge in pretty much every game jam nowadays. It can handle 10,000 blades of physically interactive grass on the screen at once, and billions if you count the off-screen blades. With that runt of a year out of the way, I can get on to 2022, my 9th year of game dev. To kick off the year with a bang, I made Gleamshroom, based on that unfinished game all those years ago, for the 14th Alka-Jam. Gleamshroom was the first time I seriously used the multiplication blend flag in Pygame, and it resulted in some really nice looking lighting. This was honestly where I hit my modern plateau in my artistic ability. I haven't improved much since, but I have some plans for 2024 that might finally be a significant upgrade. Also, some VTuber played a lightly modified version of Gleamshroom that someone modified as a fan game or something, which was the first time a big YouTuber played one of my games. To follow Gleamshroom up, I just took the assets and threw together a functional MMO type game and actually did my first international playtest of a multiplayer game. It taught me a lot of things about both networking framework architecture, since I was writing my own, and high latency game dev networking in general. In April, I made Explont for the 50th Ludum Dare. I felt like my last Ludum Dare entry went unnecessarily poorly, so I wanted to give it another shot. It's a game where you play a frog dinosaur thing that will get angry and explode unless he gets enough lollipops to eat. If you haven't noticed, that's where my current profile picture comes from. Explont ended up placing 7th in graphics. Placing top 10 in any category was always a big and seemingly achievable goal for me. Shortly after, I got into shaders with OpenGL and started mixing OpenGL with Pygame for post-processing to create the rendering pipeline that I use for my games nowadays. Initially, I did this with PyOpenGL, but I found out about ModernGL and I've been using it ever since. This was also the year that the popularity of Vagrant peaked, which happened after I added shaders. While on summer break, I worked on this isometric game meant to be a successor in terms of mechanics, not world, to Drawn Down Abyss. I ended up dropping it before making any devlogs or anything though. The game jams in 2022 didn't really line up with my availability, so I made Hue Flowing, a game with a game jam type scope and my new shader pipeline to top off the year. You're a ninja that jumps around and paints the world into existence with the magic of shaders. It was an actually solid game in my opinion, unlike most of my projects. I just feel that everything fit together very nicely. It ended up being featured on Buried Treasure, which was super nice to see. and we finally made it to my 10th year of game development, 2023. To start off the year, I created Pygame, a Pygame framework I've been using all year in some capacity to make games. It has built-in support for fancy things like foliage, grass, water, physics, particles, and even things like raycasted lighting running on shaders. As an initial test for the water and lighting, I started working on an unnamed fishing roguelite, which never really showed up on my channel. Before I knew it, the next Ludum Dare had rolled around. It was Ludum Dare 53, and I put Pygame to the test for the very first time in a game jam by making Moon Rabbit Collection, a simple game where you find lost items for bunnies on some strange moon. The aesthetic was inspired by a game called Lucid by RxI that inspired me a lot a long time ago. This was also my very first time using FL Studio in a game jam, and it made a huge difference. I placed first in graphics, including beating all the team entries out of thousands of games. I credit that to the whole game aspect interplay thing I mentioned earlier because the music turned out quite well as well and resulted in a bronze medal in the mood category. After participating in almost 30 game jams, winning a category in the Ludum Dare was an awesome achievement that I didn't think I'd ever reach. I think it's given me the confidence to really sink in some time on my first paid project in over 5 years for 2024 and finally start to move on from game jams. I'll probably keep doing them every now and then, but not as often as I used to. In my summer break, after my 8-week summer semester in university, I really focused on learning 3D game development using Godot 4 so I could make VR games, which resulted in this archery game planned to be based on Alchemic Archer that I plan on picking up again when I have more time. For reference, in case you're watching this video in the future, I also hit 50,000 subscribers here on YouTube this year, which is a huge milestone for me. If you've been keeping up with my videos, you've probably seen PixKarts, which is my 2D Mario Kart knockoff that's actually supporting online multiplayer. I've gone through a few playtests already and it's been a ton of fun. I'm hoping to release PixKarts next year. It runs on my new networking framework that I plan on keeping private for now. It's quite convenient to work with and I made a video about it, but I'm planning to rebuild it next year from the ground up with the experience I have now to create a user-friendly networking framework for Pygame. The final project from this year that you guys would know about is the Platformer Tutorial project. It's a simple game, but it's made for a tutorial to replace the 5-year-old tutorial that got my channel to where it is. If you're interested in learning Pygame and you already know Python, it's worth checking out. There are 2 more projects from this year that I haven't really shown much yet. First, we have my new avatar that I plan on using for regular streams next year. I built it using Pygame, ModernGL, and MediaPipe using lots of magical math. I'll probably have a dedicated video on it soon since it's super interesting. As my final project for 2023, I have a project that I haven't really shown because it's a project I was hired to work on that I don't own. However, the owner of the project has generously agreed to sponsor this video, so here it is. This is of Murder on Moonshine, your mobster in Prohibition era New Orleans, carrying out assassinations for control over moonshine production in the swamps. It's an intense shooter platformer running on my Pygame framework, and it's available for Wishlist on Steam with a scheduled release date of early 2024. There's a link in the description so you can go check it out. I've been contributing to the project on and off on the side all year, and I think the gameplay is turning out to be quite fun. With that, I've summarized over 50 of my major projects in my first 10 years of game development, mostly with Pygame. It's been quite the journey that can primarily be described through one thing for those of you wondering how I learned: game jams. Since I just graduated with my computer science degree this year and I'm finishing off of Murder and Moonshine, I'm about to hit a massive change of pace in my life and I'm looking forward to some awesome game dev projects I have planned. Thanks for watching until the end, and I hope you'll stick around to see my future progress in the years to come.